The blood on my kitchen floor wasn't mine. I stood there in my bare feet, my arthritis-worn hands trembling as I gripped the edge of the counter, staring at the crimson drops that had already begun to darken against the white linoleum. The silence in my house felt deafening after what had just happened. The kind of silence that comes after a storm has passed, but you're not sure if the foundation is still intact. My flowered house dress, the one my daughter Sarah had given me for Mother's Day 3 years ago, was torn at the shoulder. I could feel the cool October air seeping through the gap in the fabric, raising goosebumps on my arms. But I couldn't move. Not yet. How did helping someone buy groceries lead to this? The question echoed in my mind as I looked toward my front door, hanging open like a mouth frozen mid-scream. Through it, I could see my neighbor's house across the street, Mrs. Chin tending to her garden as if nothing had happened. As if my world hadn't just cracked open like an egg. The sirens were getting closer now. I'd called them myself, though my voice had shaken so badly I wasn't sure they understood my address. My landline phone lay on the floor where I'd dropped it, the receiver still warm from my palm. I thought about my grandchildren. Little Emma, only 7, who still believed the world was made of fairy tales and Saturday morning cartoons. And Michael, 12, who was just starting to understand that sometimes adults don't have all the answers. What would I tell them? How do you explain that kindness can be dangerous? The blood drops seemed to multiply before my eyes, each one a small reminder that my simple life, my predictable, quiet life, had just become something else entirely. Something I didn't recognize. I'd been a widow for 8 years. I'd raised 4 children. I'd buried my parents and watched my friends' marriages crumble. I thought I'd seen enough of life's surprises. I was wrong. If this story is already stirring something in your heart, I'd love to know. What time is it where you are right now, and which city or state are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. Let's see how far this story is reaching. My name is Margaret Eleanor Hartwell, and I've been walking this earth for 63 years. The lines on my hands tell stories, each crease a memory, each spot a season I've weathered. These hands kneaded bread at 4 in the morning when my youngest had colic. They held my husband's hand as he took his last breath. They've applauded at graduation ceremonies and wiped away tears at funerals. I live in a small house on Maple Street in Cedar Falls, Iowa. It's the kind of town where everyone knows your name and your business, where the biggest excitement is usually the high school football games on Friday nights. My house is nothing special. A white 2-story with blue shutters that need painting and a front porch where I sit with my morning coffee, watching the world wake up. That October morning started like any other. I remember because I was wearing my favorite slippers, the ones with the little pink roses that my granddaughter Emma had picked out for me at the department store. They were getting threadbare, but I couldn't bring myself to throw them away. Some things become part of you even when they're falling apart. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon. I'd been making apple butter the night before, the way my mother taught me back in 1974. The scent still lingered in the air, mixing with the October breeze that drifted through my half-open window above the sink. I was 63, but most days I felt both older and younger than that number suggested. Older when my knees creaked getting out of bed, when I had to squint to read the newspaper without my glasses. When Emma would call me on the phone and tell me about her day at school, her voice was bright with the kind of wonder I remembered having once. My children are grown and scattered now. Sarah lived 2 hours away in Des Moines with her family. My son David had moved to California after his divorce, chasing some dream about starting over at 45. The other 2, Michael and Jennifer, called every Sunday like clockwork, but their lives were full of their own concerns. Mortgages and car payments and teenage problems I was grateful not to have to solve anymore. I'd been a wife for 31 years before cancer took my Harold. After he died, people kept asking me if I was lonely, as if loneliness was something to be ashamed of. The truth was more complicated than that. I missed having someone to share the small moments with. The way the light fell across the kitchen table in the afternoon, or how the neighbor's cat always seemed to know when I was feeling blue. But I'd learned to find peace in the quiet. In the ritual of making my bed each morning, pulling the quilt tight and smoothing every wrinkle. In the simple pleasure of choosing what to have for dinner without having to consider anyone else's preferences. I thought I had figured out this part of my life. The calm part. The part where surprises were supposed to be birthday parties and unexpected visits from the grandchildren. That morning, as I stood at my kitchen window watching the Hendersons' teenage son drag their garbage cans to the curb, I had no idea that my carefully constructed quiet was about to shatter. It was 3 weeks before that October morning when I first met the Rodriguez family. I was at Miller's Grocery, the little store on 5th Street where I'd been shopping for 20 years. Mr. Miller knew I liked my bananas just barely ripe and that I always bought 2 pounds of ground beef on Sundays for the week's meals. It was the kind of place where they still let you pay with a check and nobody minded if you took an extra minute to count your change. I was in the cereal aisle trying to decide between the name brand and store brand oatmeal. Harold always said they tasted the same, but I swore I could tell the difference when I heard a child crying. Not the kind of crying that comes from a skinned knee or a denied candy bar. This was deeper, more desperate. The sound made my chest tight in that way it always did when I heard a child in real distress. I turned the corner toward the produce section and saw them. A young woman, maybe early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that had seen better days. She was kneeling next to a little boy who couldn't have been more than 5, speaking to him in rapid Spanish. Her voice was gentle but strained, the way mine used to sound when one of my children was having a meltdown in public and I was trying to keep my patience. The boy was clutching a small box of crackers against his chest like it was a treasure. Behind them stood a man I assumed was the father, his work clothes dusty and his face creased with worry. He kept glancing toward the checkout counter, then back at his family as if calculating something in his head. I should mind my own business, I told myself. I don't even speak Spanish. But something about the scene pulled at me. Maybe it was the way the mother kept smoothing the little boy's hair, or how the father's shoulders seemed to carry the weight of the world. Or maybe it was just that I recognized the look of people trying to stretch a dollar until it screamed. I'd been there. Even with Harold's steady job at the plant, there had been months when we'd stood in grocery store aisles doing mental math, trying to figure out how to feed 4 growing children on $30. I approached slowly, the way you might approach a frightened animal. When the woman looked up at me, I saw exhaustion in her dark eyes, but also a fierce kind of pride that I recognized immediately. "Is everything okay?" I asked softly. She spoke more English than I expected, though her accent was thick with worry. "My son, he is, how do you say? I'm very hungry. We are trying to." She gestured helplessly at their nearly empty cart, then at the box of crackers her son was clutching. I understood immediately. The crackers weren't expensive. Maybe $2. But even $2 can feel like 20 when you're counting every penny. "Miguel is very hungry," she repeated, and I heard how hard it was for her to admit this to a stranger. Pride is a funny thing. It keeps your back straight when the world tries to bend you, but it also makes it almost impossible to ask for help when you need it most. The little boy, Miguel, looked up at me with eyes that seemed too old for his small face. He said something in Spanish to his mother and she shook her head, gently trying to take the crackers from his hands. I thought about my own grandchildren, safe at home with full bellies and warm beds. I thought about the apple butter cooling in my kitchen, and the pot roast I'd planned for dinner that was big enough to feed 6 people. "Harold, what would you do?" I could almost hear his voice. "You know what you need to do, Maggie." "What's your name, sweetheart?" I asked the woman. "Carmen," she said quietly. "This is my husband, Diego, and my son, Miguel." "I'm Margaret," I said, extending my hand. Her grip was firm despite the calluses on her palms. "And I think Miguel and I need to have a little talk about crackers." I knelt down to Miguel's level, pulling out the kind of smile I used to give my own children when they were feeling scared or overwhelmed. "Those look like very good crackers," I said. "Are they your favorite?" He nodded solemnly, though I wasn't sure he understood my words. But children understand kindness in any language, and something in his posture relaxed slightly. I stood up and looked at Carmen. "I was just thinking, I made way too much apple butter last night and I hate to see it go to waste. My husband used to say I cooked like I was feeding an army." I paused, watching her face carefully. "I was wondering if you might like to take some home with you. And maybe Miguel would like those crackers to go with it." The silence stretched between us like a bridge neither of us was sure we should cross. Carmen looked at her husband, and some conversation passed between them in glances that only married couples can have. "You are very kind," Diego said finally, his English more careful than his wife's. "But we cannot." "You're not taking anything from me," I said quickly. "You'd be helping me. I can't eat all that apple butter by myself and it'll just go bad. Besides," I added, winking at Miguel, "I think this young man might be the perfect person to test it for me. I need someone with a very sophisticated palate." Miguel didn't understand the words, but he smiled at my tone. Carmen translated quietly and his smile grew wider. If you're sure. Carmen said. I'm sure. And that's how it started. With a $2 box of crackers and the understanding that sometimes helping someone else is really helping yourself. I had no idea that simple kindness would lead to blood on my kitchen floor 3 weeks later. But that afternoon, as I walked to the checkout counter and told Mr. Miller to put their groceries on my bill, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Useful. Needed. Like maybe there was still a purpose to this quiet life I'd been living. Carmen tried to refuse when she realized what I'd done, but I just smiled and shook my head. It's already done, I said. Besides, Miguel promised to let me know how the apple butter tastes. As they gathered their bags, suddenly much fuller than they'd been, Carmen pressed something into my hand. It was a small piece of paper with an address written in careful script. You come to dinner, she said. Tomorrow. Please. We cannot pay you back with money, but... You don't need to pay me back at all, I started to say, but the look in her eyes stopped me. I recognized that look. It was the same one I'd had years ago when Mrs. Patterson from down the street had brought us a casserole after Harold's surgery, and I'd felt like I owed her something I couldn't name. Pride again. The need to give something back even when you had nothing to give. Tomorrow sounds wonderful, I said. And it was. The next evening I walked the 6 blocks to their address. A small apartment above Martinez Auto Repair on the other side of town. The stairs were narrow and creaked under my feet, but the smell of cooking that greeted me at the top was incredible. Cumin and cilantro and something else I couldn't identify but immediately wanted to taste. Carmen had made tamales. Real tamales, the kind that take hours to prepare and fill the whole house with the smell of home. Diego had cleaned up from his day at the construction site and was wearing a shirt I suspected was his best one. Miguel ran to me when I knocked, chattering in Spanish and pointing toward the kitchen where his mother was putting the finishing touches on a meal that probably cost them more than they could afford. They're feeding me with money they don't have, I realized. As I helped them with money I barely noticed spending. It should have made me feel guilty. Instead it made me feel honored. We ate at a small table covered with a cloth that had seen better days but was spotlessly clean. Diego worked construction, Carmen explained, but the company he worked for wasn't always consistent with hours. Some weeks he worked 50 hours, some weeks 20. It made it hard to plan, hard to budget, hard to keep food in the house for a growing boy. Carmen worked too, cleaning houses for families in the wealthier part of town. She tried to take Miguel with her when she could, but sometimes she had to leave him with Mrs. Santos downstairs, who watched 3 other children in her small apartment. It is not what we planned, Diego said carefully, his English improving as the evening went on. In Mexico I was, how you say, supervisor. For a construction company. But here. He shrugged, the gesture encompassing all the complications of starting over in a place where your experience doesn't count and your accent makes people assume you don't know what you're doing. Here it is different, Carmen added. But Miguel will have better chances. Better school. Better future. I looked at Miguel, who was carefully eating his tamale and sneaking glances at me like he still couldn't quite believe I was really there. They left everything they knew for him, I thought. For this little boy's future. I told them about my own children, how proud I was of their success but how much I missed the chaos of a house full of voices. I told them about Harold, about how he'd worked double shifts at the plant when the kids were small, coming home exhausted but always asking about homework and soccer practice and school plays. Family is everything, Diego said, raising his glass of water in a toast. Family is everything, I agreed. I left that night with a container of leftover tamales and Carmen's promise that I'd come back soon. As I walked home through the October darkness, I felt something shifting inside my chest. For the first time since Harold died, I was excited about something. Not just content or peaceful, but actually excited. Maybe this is what the next part of my life looks like, I thought. Maybe I'm not done being needed after all. I had no idea how right I was. Or how dangerous that need would become. Over the next 2 weeks, Carmen and I fell into an easy friendship. She would stop by on her way home from work, sometimes with Miguel in tow, and we'd sit on my front porch drinking tea and watching the neighborhood wind down for the evening. She told me about her childhood in Guadalajara, about the grandmother who raised her when her parents died in a car accident. About meeting Diego at a church dance when she was 19 and knowing immediately that he was the man she wanted to build a life with. About the years they spent saving every peso for the journey north, for the chance to give Miguel opportunities they'd never had. I told her about my own struggles as a young mother, about the nights when Harold worked late and I felt like I was drowning in laundry and crying babies and meals that never seemed to satisfy anyone. About the way grief had settled into my bones after Harold died, how some days I forgot what it felt like to laugh until my stomach hurt. It's funny how easy it is to talk to someone when you don't have to pretend your life has been perfect. Miguel started calling me Abuela Margaret, Grandma Margaret. The first time he said it, my eyes filled with tears so quickly I had to turn away. My own grandchildren lived so far away, and their visits were precious but infrequent. Having a little voice call me Grandma again, even in another language, filled a space in my heart I hadn't realized was empty. But it was on a Thursday afternoon in mid-October that everything started to change. Carmen arrived at my house earlier than usual, Miguel's hand clutched tightly in hers. Her face was pale and there were dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't hide. "Margaret," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "I need to ask you something. Something big." We sat in my living room, Miguel curled up on the couch with a coloring book I kept for him, his small fingers working carefully to stay inside the lines. Carmen twisted her hands in her lap, a gesture I'd learned meant she was struggling with something important. "Diego's boss," she started, then stopped. "The construction company. They are saying there might not be work for him much longer. The project they are working on is almost finished, and they do not have another one lined up." I felt my stomach tighten. I'd seen this story before in my own neighborhood, in my own family. One day you have steady work, the next day you're calling everyone you know, trying to find something, anything to keep food on the table. "There is another job," Carmen continued, her voice so quiet I had to lean forward to hear her. "In Kansas City. Diego's cousin works there for a big company. They need good workers and the pay is better. Much better." My heart sank. I'd grown attached to this little family in a way that surprised me. The thought of Carmen and Miguel moving away felt like losing something I'd just found. "That sounds like a wonderful opportunity," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yes, but..." Carmen looked at Miguel, then back at me. "The job starts next Monday. Diego needs to be there on Monday morning, or they will give it to someone else." "Next Monday? That's only 4 days away." "Yes. And we do not have money for Diego to go there and find a place for us to live. The job pays well, but they do not pay until the end of the first week. Diego would need money for gas, for a hotel room, for a deposit on an apartment." I understood immediately what she was asking and why it was so hard for her to ask it. "How much?" I said simply. Carmen's eyes filled with tears. "We have calculated, maybe $800. For gas and hotel and deposit. It is too much. I know it is too much. But Diego, he has been out of work for 3 days already, and we have no savings left, and Miguel needs..." $800, I repeated. $800. It wasn't a fortune, but it wasn't nothing either. It was most of my monthly Social Security check. It was grocery money and utility bills and the small repairs my old house always needed. But it was also the difference between this family having a future and Diego falling into the cycle of unemployment that could trap them in poverty for years. What would Harold do? "I can do $800, I said. Carmen's face crumpled. "Margaret, no. We cannot. We will pay you back every penny, but it might take months, maybe a year." "I know you will," I said. "I'm not worried about that." And I wasn't. If there was one thing I'd learned about Carmen and Diego in the past 2 weeks, it was that their words meant something. If they said they'd pay me back, they would find a way. "But there is another problem," Carmen said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Diego needs to leave tomorrow morning. Early. To get there in time to find a place and be ready for work on Monday. But I cannot go with him." "Why not?" "I have 3 houses to clean this weekend. Mrs. Patterson, Mrs. Chin, and Mrs. Morrison. If I cancel, they will find someone else and I cannot lose this work. Without Diego's job, my cleaning money is all we have." I nodded. It made sense, but it also meant Diego would be traveling alone, trying to set up a new life for his family in a city where he knew only one person. So Diego will go alone, find an apartment, start the job. Then in 2 weeks, when he gets his first paycheck, he will send money for Miguel and me to take the bus to Kansas City. 2 weeks. Carmen and Miguel would be alone for 2 weeks, with no income except what she could make cleaning houses. In an apartment they probably couldn't afford by themselves. This is getting complicated. "Where will you stay while Diego is gone?" I asked. Carmen looked embarrassed. We think, maybe Mrs. Santos downstairs will let us stay with her. She has 4 children in 2 bedrooms, but maybe Miguel and I can sleep on the couch. The picture forming in my mind was heartbreaking. Carmen and Miguel essentially homeless for 2 weeks, sleeping on a stranger's couch, while Diego worked in a new city to try to earn enough money to reunite his family. That's not going to work, I said. It is only 2 weeks. Carmen. I waited until she looked at me. You and Miguel are going to stay here. Her eyes widened. Margaret, no. We cannot impose. You're not imposing. I'm offering. I have 3 empty bedrooms upstairs and it gets lonely in this big house. Besides, I added, smiling at Miguel, I need someone to help me test the rest of that apple butter. Miguel looked up from his coloring book, catching the tone if not the words. Manzana? He asked hopefully. Sí, mi amor, Carmen said, then looked back at me. Margaret, you do not understand what you are offering. Miguel, he wakes up sometimes with bad dreams. Then I am not always easy to live with when I am worried about Diego. Honey, I said gently, I raised 4 children. I think I can handle one little boy and his worried mama. That night, I drove to the bank and withdrew $800 from my savings account. It left me with less than $200 until my next Social Security check arrived, but I'd lived through lean times before. I could do it again. The next morning, Diego came to my house before dawn to say goodbye. I pressed the envelope of money into his hands and refused to let him thank me. You take care of yourself, I told him. And you call Carmen every night, you understand? She's going to worry. I will call, he promised. And Margaret, we will not forget this. Never. I watched from my front porch as his old pickup truck disappeared down Maple Street, taillights fading into the gray morning. Then I went inside to make breakfast for Carmen and Miguel, who were still sleeping in my guest room. This is the right thing to do, I told myself. This is what family does for family. I had no idea that someone had been watching Diego leave. Someone who had been watching our friendship develop over the past 2 weeks. Someone who had very different ideas about what I should be doing with my money and my kindness. It was Carmen who first noticed the man across the street. 3 days after Diego left, she was washing dishes at my kitchen sink when she suddenly went very still. Margaret, she said quietly, there is a man outside. Across the street. He has been there for a long time. I dried my hands and looked out the window. There was indeed a man standing by the lamppost across from my house, smoking a cigarette and occasionally glancing toward my front door. He was tall and thin with graying hair and clothes that had seen better days. I've never seen him before, I said. Maybe he's visiting someone. But even as I said it, something felt wrong. The way he was standing, the way he kept looking at my house didn't feel casual. It felt deliberate. Maybe, Carmen said, but her voice was tight with worry. An hour later the man was gone. But the next morning he was back. And the morning after that. He's watching us, I realized with a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. But why? The answer came in the form of a knock on my door that Friday evening. Carmen was upstairs helping Miguel with his bath, their voices mixing Spanish and English in the way that had become the soundtrack of my house over the past week. I was in the kitchen starting dinner and feeling more content than I had in months. This is what I've been missing, I thought as I listened to Miguel's laughter echo down the stairs. This feeling of being needed, of having people to take care of. The knock was sharp and insistent. When I opened the door, I found myself face to face with a man I recognized immediately, though I'd never spoken to him before. Dale Hoffman. He lived 4 blocks away in one of the newer developments that had sprung up on the edge of town in the past decade. I knew him by reputation. He was loud at city council meetings, always complaining about taxes or property values or some perceived injustice. The kind of man who seemed to find fault with everything and solutions for nothing. Mrs. Hartwell, he said, not waiting for me to invite him in. I think we need to talk. About what? About the illegals you're harboring in your house. The words hit me like a slap. Excuse me. Don't play dumb. The whole neighborhood's been talking about it. You've got that Mexican family living here, don't you? That woman and her kid. I felt heat rising in my chest, the kind of anger that starts slow and builds to something dangerous. Carmen and Miguel are my guests. Your guests. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. That's rich. You know what I think? I think you're being taken advantage of. These people, they're probably illegal and they're using you. taking your money, living in your house for free. Mr. Hoffman, I said, my voice deadly calm, I think you need to leave. I'm just trying to help you, Mrs. Hartwell. You're a widow living alone. These people, they see that and they target you. They'll bleed you dry and then disappear in the middle of the night. How does he know I'm helping them financially? How do you know anything about what I do or don't do for my friends? Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of satisfaction that made my skin crawl. This is a small town, Mrs. Hartwell. People talk. People notice when someone starts throwing money around, helping people who probably don't even belong in this country. I started to close the door, but he put his hand against it, stopping me. Here's what's going to happen, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than shouting. You're going to stop helping these people. You're going to ask them to leave your house. And you're going to encourage them to move somewhere else. And if I don't? His smile was as cold as winter. Well, I'd hate for anyone to start asking questions about your new friends. Questions about their legal status. Questions about whether you're harboring illegal immigrants. Questions about whether you're committing federal crimes by helping them. The threat hung in the air between us like smoke. Get off my property, I said. Think about it, Mrs. Hartwell. Think about what happens to nice old ladies who get caught helping criminals. Think about what happens to their families when the government gets involved. He stepped back, but his eyes never left mine. I'll be watching, he said. We'll all be watching. And then he was gone, disappearing into the October darkness like a bad dream. I closed the door and leaned against it, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. My hands were shaking, and I realized I was more frightened than I'd been since Harold's diagnosis. He knows about the money. He knows Diego left town. How does he know so much? Margaret. Carmen's voice came from the top of the stairs. Is everything okay? I looked up at her, standing there with a towel in her hands and worry written across her face, and I made a decision that would change everything. Everything's fine, I lied. Just someone selling something. But everything was not fine. And that night, as I lay in bed listening to Carmen and Miguel sleeping peacefully down the hall, I realized that my simple act of kindness had painted a target on all our backs. The harassment started small. Saturday morning, I found my garbage cans overturned, their contents scattered across my driveway. When I called the city about it, they said it was probably raccoons, but I'd lived in this house for 20 years and never had a problem with raccoons before. Sunday, someone toilet papered my oak tree. The white streamers fluttered in the October wind like surrender flags, but I knew it wasn't surrender they were signaling. It was a war. Monday morning, Carmen found a note tucked under my front door mat. It was written in block letters on a piece of notebook paper. Illegal aliens not welcome here. I crumpled it up and threw it away before Miguel could see it, but Carmen's face had gone pale as paper. Maybe. She started, then stopped. Maybe Miguel and I should go stay with Mrs. Santos after all. Absolutely not, I said, surprised by the fierceness in my own voice. This is my house and you are my guest. Some ignorant bully isn't going to change that. But privately I was beginning to worry. Not for myself, I'd weathered plenty of storms in my 63 years, but for Carmen and Miguel. They'd come to this country looking for safety and opportunity, and instead they were being targeted because of their association with me. Or maybe I'm being targeted because of my association with them. Either way, it didn't matter. What mattered was that a 5-year-old boy was starting to ask his mother why the lady across the street was always watching them through her window. What mattered was that Carmen had started jumping every time. The phone rang or someone knocked on the door. Diego called every night at 7 o'clock sharp, and I could hear the strain in Carmen's voice as she tried to keep their conversations light and positive. She didn't tell him about Dale Hoffman's visit or the vandalism or the notes. She talked about the job interviews she'd been on, about Miguel's progress with his English, about how much she missed him. She's protecting him, I realized. She doesn't want him to worry when he needs to focus on establishing himself in Kansas City. It was the same thing I'd done countless times as a young mother, shielding Harold from the worst of my worries so he could concentrate on providing for our family. It was an act of love, but it was also incredibly lonely. Wednesday brought a new escalation. I was at Miller's Grocery doing my weekly shopping when I noticed the whispers. People who had known me for years were suddenly finding excuses to avoid making eye contact. Conversations stopped when I walked down an aisle, then resumed in hushed tones after I passed. At the checkout counter, Mr. Miller, who had always been friendly, who had asked about my children and remembered Harold's birthday every year, barely spoke to me beyond the necessities of completing the transaction. "That'll be $37.50, he said, not meeting my eyes. I paid with exact change, coins I'd counted carefully because money was tighter than usual. As I gathered my bags, I heard a voice behind me. "Shame, what's happening to this neighborhood?" I turned to see Mrs. Patterson, a woman I'd known for 15 years whose daughter had babysat my grandchildren, standing with two other women I recognized from church. "All kinds of undesirable elements moving in," she continued, her voice just loud enough for me to hear. "People who don't share our values. He's talking about Carmen and Miguel. He's talking about my friends. Some folks just don't know when to mind their own business," added Betty Morrison, the woman whose house Carmen cleaned every Friday. The same house where Carmen scrubs toilets and mops floors to earn money to feed her son. I wanted to say something. I wanted to turn around and tell these women exactly what I thought of their values. But Miguel was waiting for me at home, excited about the new crayons I'd promised to bring him, and Carmen was making tamales for dinner because she'd found masa flour on sale. I had bigger things to worry about than the small-minded prejudices of people I'd clearly never known as well as I thought I did. But the isolation was beginning to wear on me. For the first time in years, I felt truly alone in my own community. Thursday night, the phone calls started. The first one came at 11:30, just as I was settling into bed with a cup of tea and a mystery novel. When I answered, there was silence for a moment, then a voice I didn't recognize. "Stop helping them." "Who is this?" "You know who this is. Stop helping them or we'll make you stop." The line went dead. I sat there holding the phone, my tea growing cold in my other hand, and felt something I hadn't experienced since I was a child. Genuine fear. Not the manageable anxiety of everyday life, but the deep, primal fear that comes when you realize someone wants to hurt you. The second call came an hour later. This time the voice was different, but the message was the same. "Send them back where they came from." "These are Americans," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "This is America. Not for much longer if people like you keep letting them in." I unplugged the phone from the wall and went to check the locks on all my doors. Then I went upstairs and stood outside Carmen and Miguel's room, listening to their quiet breathing and trying to convince myself that everything would be okay. "This will pass," I told myself. "People will get bored and move on to something else to complain about." But deep down I knew it wouldn't be that simple. There was something ugly growing in my little town. Something that had been hiding beneath the surface of polite conversations and neighborly waves. My friendship with Carmen and Miguel hadn't created that ugliness, but it had certainly brought it into the light. Friday morning brought the worst escalation yet. Carmen left early for her job at Mrs. Morrison's house, taking Miguel with her because I had a doctor's appointment for my annual checkup. They would be gone most of the day, which meant I had time to think about everything that had been happening. Maybe Carmen is right, I thought as I sat in Dr. Peterson's waiting room, thumbing through a magazine without really seeing the pages. Maybe it would be better if they stayed somewhere else until Diego gets established in Kansas City. But even as I thought it, I knew I couldn't suggest it. Not because of my own loneliness, though the thought of going back to an empty house made my chest tight, but because of what it would mean to give in to the bullies. If I back down now, if I let fear make my decisions, then what does that say about everything I raised my children to believe? Harold and I had taught our kids that standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but it's always necessary. That sometimes doing the right thing costs you something, but not doing it costs you even more. I can't look Miguel in the eye and tell him that some people's hatred is stronger than my love. Dr. Peterson pronounced me healthy for a woman my age, with the usual reminders about calcium and exercise and getting enough sleep. As I drove home, I felt oddly peaceful. Not because the problems had gone away, but because I'd made a decision about how to face them. Whatever happens, we face it together. But when I turned onto Maple Street, I saw something that made my blood run cold. My front door was standing wide open. I parked in the driveway and sat there for a moment, staring at the dark rectangle where my closed door should have been. The rational part of my mind said I should call the police immediately, but another part, the part that had been dealing with whispers and threats and phone calls, wondered if the police would even care. What if they think I deserve this? What if they think I brought it on myself? I got out of the car slowly, my purse clutched against my chest like armor. As I approached the front door, I could see that it hadn't been forced open. There was no damage to the frame or the lock. Someone had unlocked it and walked right in. Someone who had a key. Or someone who knew where I kept my spare key. My hands shook as I stepped across the threshold into my own home. The living room looked like a tornado had gone through it. Couch cushions were scattered across the floor, their contents spilling out like stuffing from a broken toy. My coffee table was overturned, magazines and photo albums spread across the carpet. The drawers of my antique secretary desk had been pulled out and dumped, papers everywhere. But it wasn't random destruction. Someone had been looking for something. In the kitchen, every cabinet door hung open, dishes and glassware scattered across the counters. But again, nothing seemed to be missing, just searched through, violated. What were they looking for? I climbed the stairs on unsteady legs, dreading what I might find in the bedrooms. Carmen and Miguel's room had been completely ransacked. Their few belongings, clothes Diego hadn't been able to fit in his truck, Miguel's favorite toys, the little backpack Carmen used as a purse, were strewn across the floor like discarded trash. But it was what I found on the bed that made my knees buckle. Someone had taken a black marker and written across the white pillowcase, "They don't belong here. And neither do you." I sank down on the edge of the bed, surrounded by the wreckage of my home and my friends' belongings, and finally let myself cry. Not the gentle tears of sadness I'd grown accustomed to since Harold died, but the raw, angry sobs of someone who has been pushed too far. They invaded my home. They touched Miguel's toys. They destroyed the safe space I'd tried to create for a frightened family. The violation felt almost physical, as if someone had put their hands on me without permission. I'd lived in this house for 20 years, raised children here, nursed my husband through his final illness here. It was supposed to be sacred. And now it feels contaminated. I was still sitting there, surrounded by destruction, when I heard Carmen's key in the front door lock. She called out as she always did when she came home. "Margaret, we're back. Miguel wants to show you the picture he drew at Mrs. Morrison's house." I heard their footsteps in the hallway below, and heard the exact moment when Carmen saw the living room. Her sharp intake of breath. Miguel's confused question in Spanish. The terrible silence that followed. "Margaret." Carmen's voice was tight with fear. "Margaret, where are you?" "I'm upstairs," I called, trying to keep my voice steady. "But Carmen, don't let Miguel come up here yet." I heard her rapid footsteps on the stairs, and heard her stop in the doorway of their room. When I looked up at her, her face was white as chalk. "Dios mío," she whispered, then looked at me with eyes full of guilt and sorrow. "Margaret, I am so sorry. This is because of us. This is our fault." "No," I said firmly, standing up and wiping my eyes. "This is not your fault. This is the fault of small, hateful people who don't understand what this country is supposed to be about." But even as I said it, I wondered if I was being naive. If my desire to help had put us all in danger, I wasn't prepared to handle it. What if they come back? What if next time they don't just destroy things? What if next time Miguel is here? From downstairs I could hear Miguel calling for his mother, his voice starting to sound worried. Carmen looked torn between going to comfort him and staying to help me process what had happened. "Go to him," I said. "I'll be down in a minute. We need to figure out what to do next." As Carmen's footsteps retreated down the stairs, I looked around the destroyed room one more time. Miguel's coloring books scattered across the floor, their pages torn. At Carmen's Sunday dress, the one she wore to the little Catholic church across town, wadded up in the corner like garbage. They want us to be afraid. They want us to feel like we don't belong. But standing there in the wreckage of my home, I felt something stronger than fear. I felt furious. The kind of clean, righteous anger that burns away doubt and leaves only determination. They picked the wrong grandmother to mess with. It was Saturday morning when everything came to a head. I'd spent Friday night helping Carmen and Miguel clean up the mess, turning the violation back into a home. Miguel, bless his heart, treated it like a game, carefully placing his crayons back in their box and arranging his toy cars in neat rows on the shelf I'd cleared for him. Carmen worked in silence, her jaw set in a way that reminded me of myself at her age, determined not to let the bastards see her break. We'd decided not to call the police. What would we tell them? That someone had searched through our belongings without taking anything? That we suspected it was connected to the harassment we'd been receiving? In a town where half the people thought we deserved what we got, I wasn't sure whose side the law would be on. Maybe that makes me a coward, I thought as I remade the bed with fresh sheets, covering the ugly words someone had written on the pillowcase. but I can't risk making things worse for Carmen and Miguel. Saturday morning dawned gray and cold, with the kind of October wind that strips the last leaves from the trees and reminds you that winter is coming whether you're ready or not. I was in the kitchen making pancakes, Miguel's favorite, when I saw the cars. 3 pickup trucks parked across the street. Men standing around them smoking cigarettes and talking in low voices. Every few minutes one of them would look toward my house and say something that made the others laugh. They're not even trying to hide it anymore. "Carmen," I called softly. "Can you come here for a minute?" She appeared in the doorway, Miguel trailing behind her with syrup on his chin and a smile that could light up the whole world. "Look," I said, nodding toward the window. Carmen moved to the sink and peered out through the curtains. I watched her face change, saw the fear creep back into her eyes. "How many?" she asked quietly. 6 men. Maybe 7. Miguel tugged on his mother's shirt, chattering in Spanish. She answered him absently, her attention focused on the gathering across the street. "Margaret," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I think we need to call Diego." "And tell him what?" "That he should abandon the first real opportunity he's had in months to come back and protect us from bullies." "But if something happens?" "Nothing is going to happen," I said with more confidence than I felt. "They're just trying to intimidate us." But even as I said it, I was reaching for my purse, checking to make sure my cell phone was charged. Just in case. That's when the doorbell rang. We all froze. Miguel stopped chattering and looked back and forth between his mother and me, picking up on the tension in the room. The bell rang again, followed by loud knocking. "Mrs. Hartwell," a voice called out. "We know you're in there. We just want to talk." I recognized the voice. Dale Hoffman. "Stay here," I told Carmen. "Keep Miguel in the kitchen." "Margaret, no. Don't answer it. If I don't answer it, they'll just keep coming back. At least this way I can control when and where the conversation happens." I walked to the front door, my spine straight and my chin up, channeling every ounce of stubborn pride my Irish grandmother had passed down to me. Through the peephole I could see Dale Hoffman and 2 other men I didn't recognize standing on my porch. Behind them the rest of the group waited by their trucks. I opened the door but kept the security chain latched. "Mr. Hoffman," I said politely. "What can I do for you?" "We tried to handle this the nice way, Mrs. Hartwell. We tried to give you a chance to do the right thing. But you didn't listen. I'm not sure what you think the right thing is, but I'm pretty confident it doesn't involve breaking into someone's home and destroying their property." His face didn't change, but I saw something flicker in his eyes. Satisfaction maybe. Or confirmation that he'd gotten the reaction he wanted. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "But I do know that harboring illegal immigrants is a federal crime. And we've decided it's time to report you to the proper authorities." There it is. The real threat. "Carmen and Miguel are my guests," I said evenly. "Last I checked, having guests wasn't illegal in America." "Guests with proper documentation," said one of the other men, stepping forward. He was younger than Hoffman, with the kind of swagger that suggested he'd been the high school bully and never grown out of it. "You got their paperwork? You got proof they belong here?" "I don't need proof of anything. This is my house and they are welcome in it." "Not anymore," Hoffman said. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to go inside and tell your illegal friends that they have 1 hour to pack their things and leave town. If they're not gone by noon, we're calling Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And we're going to tell them that you've been harboring fugitives." The words hit me like a physical blow. Not because I believed them, I was reasonably sure Carmen and Miguel were here legally, though I'd never asked for details, but because of what they represented. The willingness to use fear and government authority as weapons against people whose only crime was needing help. This is how it starts, I thought. This is how good people become complicit in evil. By being too afraid to stand up when it matters. "And if I refuse?" Hoffman's smile was as cold as winter. "Well, I'd hate for anything to happen to a nice old lady like you. Accidents happen all the time. Houses catch fire. People fall downstairs. It would be a real shame if something like that happened while you were all alone in this big house." The threat was clear, and for a moment, I felt that familiar fear creeping up my spine. I was 63 years old, alone except for a young mother and her 5-year-old son. These men were younger, stronger, and apparently willing to do whatever it took to get what they wanted. I should give in. I should tell Carmen and Miguel to pack their things. I should choose safety over principle. But then I heard something that changed everything. From the kitchen came the sound of Miguel's laughter, bright and innocent and completely unaware that there were people in the world who wanted to hurt him for the color of his skin and the language he spoke at home. And suddenly I wasn't a frightened old woman anymore. I was a grandmother. A mother. A protector of children. "Mr. Hoffman," I said, my voice steady as granite, "I want you and your friends to get off my property. Now." "You're making a mistake, Mrs. Hartwell. The only mistake I made was not calling the police the first time you showed up here with your threats." I started to close the door, but Hoffman put his hand against it, stopping me. "Last chance," he said. That's when I saw the baseball bat in his hand. "They didn't come here to talk. They came here to hurt us." Everything slowed down the way it does in moments of real crisis. I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel the weight of my cell phone in my pocket, could smell the coffee I'd been brewing in the kitchen. And I could hear Carmen's voice, speaking softly to Miguel in Spanish, trying to keep him calm while his world fell apart around him. "Not on my watch." I slammed the door shut and threw the deadbolt, then ran to the kitchen where Carmen was holding Miguel against her chest, her eyes wide with terror. "Call 911, I said, tossing her my cell phone. "Tell them we have armed men threatening us at 412 Maple Street. Margaret, what if they break in? Then we'll deal with that when it happens. But right now we call for help." The sound of breaking glass came from the living room. "They're not waiting for us to come out. They're coming in." I grabbed the biggest knife from my block on the counter. Not because I had any intention of using it, but because I needed to feel like I had some way to protect the people I loved. The people I love. When did that happen? When did Carmen and Miguel stop being charity cases and start being family? Heavy footsteps in my living room. Hoffman's voice, loud and angry. "Mrs. Hartwell. We know you're in there. This can end easy or it can end hard, but it's going to end." Carmen was speaking rapidly into the phone, giving our address and trying to explain the situation to the 911 operator. Miguel had gone very quiet, the way children do when they sense real danger. More footsteps. They were spreading out, searching the house. "They're going to find us. And when they do..." I looked at Miguel, pressed against his mother's shoulder, and made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I stepped out of the kitchen and into the hallway, the knife held low at my side. "I'm here," I called out. "You want to talk to me? Here I am." Hoffman appeared at the end of the hallway, the baseball bat still in his hand. Behind him I could see two other men, both carrying what looked like tire irons. "Where are they?" he demanded. "Gone," I lied. "They left this morning." "Bullshit. We've been watching the house. Nobody left." He started walking toward me and I realized that this was it. This was the moment when my simple act of kindness had led us all to the edge of real violence. I should be terrified. Why am I not terrified? Maybe it was the adrenaline. Maybe it was the knowledge that Carmen was calling for help. Or maybe it was just the stubborn Irish refusal to back down that had gotten me in trouble my whole life. "Mr. Hoffman," I said calmly, "you have about 3 minutes before the police get here. I suggest you and your friends leave now before you do something you can't take back." "The police." He laughed, but there was uncertainty in it now. "You think the police are going to side with you over us? This is our town, lady. We belong here." "So do I. I've lived here for 20 years. I've paid taxes here, voted here, raised my children here. And I'll be damned if I'm going to let a bunch of bullies tell me who I can and can't invite into my home." That's when I heard it, the most beautiful sound in the world. Sirens. Hoffman heard them too. His face went pale and he looked back toward his friends, who were already starting to retreat toward the broken window they'd climbed through. "This isn't over," he said. "Yes," I replied, "it is." And for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I really believed it. The police arrested 3 men that day. Dale Hoffman and 2 others whose names I never bothered to learn. The rest scattered like cockroaches when the lights came on, though I was pretty sure I knew who most of them were. Small towns don't have that many secrets. The charges were serious: breaking and entering, criminal threatening, intimidation. Hoffman tried to claim they were just concerned citizens exercising their right to free speech. But the baseball bat and the broken window made that argument pretty hard to sell. Carmen and Miguel moved to Kansas City 2 weeks later as planned. Diego had found them a small apartment near his new job, and his first paycheck had been enough to cover the bus tickets and a security deposit. The morning they left, I stood on my front porch and watched Carmen load their few possessions into Mrs. Santos's car for the ride to the bus station. Miguel ran back to me 3 times for one more hug. His small arms wrapped around my waist like he was trying to memorize the feeling. "You call me every week," I told Carmen. "And you send pictures. I want to see Miguel's first day at his new school." "We will never forget what you did for us," she said, her eyes bright with tears. "Never. You'd have done the same for me." And I knew that was true. In the short time I'd known them, Carmen and Miguel had given me something I thought I'd lost forever: a sense of purpose. A reason to get up in the morning that was bigger than my own comfort and routine. They didn't just take my help. They gave me back my life. The trial was held the following spring. I testified about the threats, the phone calls, the break-in. Carmen flew back from Kansas City to testify about the fear she'd felt for her son's safety, the way the harassment had made her question whether coming to America had been a mistake. Hoffman got 18 months in prison. The other 2 got probation and community service. More importantly, the trial made the local news and then the regional news and finally the national news. The story of a small-town grandmother standing up to bullies resonated with people in ways I never expected. Letters poured in from all over the country. Some were from people who'd faced similar harassment for helping immigrants. Others were from immigrants themselves, thanking me for treating them like human beings worthy of kindness and respect. But the letter that meant the most came from my own granddaughter Emma, now 8 years old and apparently paying more attention to the news than I'd given her credit for. "Dear Grandma Margaret," she wrote in her careful second-grade penmanship, "Mommy told me about what you did for your friends. I think you are very brave. When I grow up, I want to be brave like you. Love, Emma. P.S. Can Miguel come visit us sometime? I want to teach him how to play American games." Out of the mouths of babes. 3 years have passed since that October morning when everything changed. Carmen and Miguel still live in Kansas City, where Diego has been promoted to supervisor and Carmen has started her own house cleaning business. Miguel is in 3rd grade now, bilingual and brilliant and completely American in the way that only children can be. They visit me every summer, staying in the same guest room where they once hid from people who wanted to hurt them. Miguel is taller now, his English perfect but still seasoned with Spanish phrases that make my heart happy. He calls me Abuela Margaret and means it. Carmen always brings tamales and I always make apple butter. We sit on my front porch in the evenings watching the neighborhood kids play in yards where their families have lived for generations, and talk about the way the world is changing. "Do you ever regret it?" Carmen asked me last summer watching Miguel chase fireflies in my backyard. "Helping us. Getting involved." I thought about it for a moment and really considered the question. The harassment had been terrible. The fear had been real. The violation of my home had left scars that took a long time to heal. But then I looked at Miguel, this beautiful, brilliant boy who might have grown up believing the world was full of people who hated him for existing. Instead, he'd learned that there are people willing to fight for what's right, even when it costs them something. "Never," I said. "Not for a single second. Because this is what love looks like. This is what family means. Not just the people who share your blood, but the people you choose to stand with when standing becomes dangerous." Dale Hoffman was released from prison after serving 14 months. He moved away from Cedar Falls and I haven't seen him since. I heard through the grapevine that he's working at a gas station in another county, telling anyone who'll listen that he was the victim of political correctness run amok. Let him tell whatever story he needs to tell. I know what really happened. What really happened was that kindness won. Not easily, not without cost, but it won. A little boy who might have grown up afraid instead grew up loved. A family that might have been scattered by hatred instead found a home. And a lonely grandmother learned that family isn't just about genetics. Sometimes it's about choice. Sometimes it's about standing up and saying, "Not on my watch." Not to people I love. The people I love. My house is quiet again now most of the time, but it's a different kind of quiet than it was before Carmen and Miguel came into my life. It's not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of contentment. Of a life well lived and choices well made. I still make apple butter every October, though now I make twice as much because I know Carmen will call and ask me to send some to Kansas City. I still sit on my front porch in the evenings, but now I'm not just watching the world go by. I'm part of it. And sometimes when Miguel calls me on the phone to tell me about his day at school or a book he's reading or a new friend he's made, I remember that October morning when everything changed. When a simple act of kindness led to blood on my kitchen floor, but also to the discovery that love is stronger than hate, always. Even when it doesn't feel that way. Even when it costs you everything you thought you couldn't afford to lose. Especially then. If you've made it this far, thank you for walking this road with me. I hope this story gave you strength, or at least the feeling that you're not alone. Comment where you're watching from and maybe subscribe. Let's build a place where voices like mine, and maybe even yours, are finally heard.